You're listening to the Spark Radio Network, internet radio like you've never heard before. Innovation, creativity, and imagination are all said to begin with a spark. So fasten your seatbelt and take the ride of your life and listen for the spark.
You are listening to KLRN Radio, where liberty and reason still reign.
Hey, this is John Preston, Marine Combat Veteran and Pacific Records recording artist. Just reaching out to have you check out our new album, Battle Cry, Songs of America's Heroes, an album featuring phenomenal other combat veteran artists like Scott Brown of the Scooter Brown Band, Ryan Weaver, Rowdy Johnson, just an incredible mix of people. This is all veterans telling our stories and our lives, and we're giving 100% of our proceeds to the Valkyrie Initiative to help veterans and first responders integrate back into society. I myself have battled with post-traumatic stress for many years and lost my own brother, a Marine Corps veteran, to suicide. I ask that you step with us and make this happen. We are in pre-order right now and release on March 17th. Go to iTunes, go to Amazon, buy. We plan on making the charts and making it at a very high level, and your support right now makes a difference. This is the release of my new song, Superman Falls, which is actually about the loss of my own brother, which happened last year, and I would love for everyone to check it out, to listen, and hopefully it'll make a difference in many lives.
If you're 85 or younger, would you like peace of mind and comfort for your family? We're Final Expense Direct with an urgent message for you. The average funeral today costs over $8,000, but the most you'll get from government benefits is $255. How will your family pay the difference? We can help. Our senior plans start as low as just $1 a day and pay up to $30,000 for a funeral and other final expenses. Peace of mind is easy. There's no medical exam. You'll have lifetime coverage, and your plan can't be canceled as long as you pay your premiums. Call now for free information about our senior plans. Answer a few simple questions and receive approval right on the phone. Plus, call right now and we'll give you a discount prescription card for free. Call 800-553-8687. That's 800-553-8687. Again, 800-553-8687. 687.
This is Slickery Trigger for Rebel Road Tactical. With proper care and feeding, your pistol will be ready when you need it. There to save your life. Shouldn't your gear be that good? Whether you need a holster for comfortable everyday carry or a tough-as-nails holster for your next training course, Rebel Road Tactical has what you need. Check us out on the web at rebelroadtactical.com.
Sometimes riders feel lost, unsure why a passage may not be working. It takes another set of eyes to help us nurture our writing into full maturity. At Black Wolf Editorial Services, we strive to enable writers to develop and grow, offering manuscript critiques and line edits through a mentoring editorial style. We also offer assistance on generating a writer's bio for your websites. Black Wolf Editorial Services, nurturing your writing into maturity. For a full list of services, visit blackwolfeditorial.com.
Here's George Foreman with InventHelp.
Hi, I'm George Foreman. Do you have an idea for a new product or invention? People ask me all the time, George, how do I get my idea in front of companies? How do I get a patent? What do I do next? Do you have the same questions? I'll tell you like I'll tell them all. Call my friends at InventHelp.
Call InventHelp today for free information. InventHelp has been helping inventors for more than 30 years and has sales offices nationwide. InventHelp can submit your invention to companies who are interested in receiving new ideas. If you have an idea and want to try to patent it and submit it to companies, you should call InventHelp today for free information.
Listen, I can't guarantee a company will be interested in your idea, but I believe every inventor deserves the opportunity to step into the ring and take their best shot. Put InventHelp in your corner.
Get your free inventor's information. Call 1-800-353-6490. That's 1-800-353-6490. Again, 1-800-353-6490.
KLRN Radio has advertising rates available. We have rates to fit almost any budget. Contact us at advertising@klrnradio.com.
You're listening to the Spark Radio Network, Internet radio like you've never heard before. Innovation, creativity, and imagination are all said to begin with a spark. So fasten your seatbelt and take the ride of your life and listen for the spark.
You are listening to KLRN Radio, where liberty and reason still reign.
My name is Jessie. I'm a United States Special Forces widow. This gives me a unique perspective on the world around us. If you're willing to listen, I'll tell you how I see it, and I won't pull any punches. This is my POV, which stands for Point of View.
All right, this is Jessie. How y'all doing out there tonight? You know I miss you when we're not talking. All right, tonight I have got a special commercial-free interview with one of my favorite recurring guests, Justin Kinney. And what we cover is the psychology behind suicide bombing. Now this is I acknowledge this is a very intense, hard-hitting topic. You have been warned. It is a very somewhat tough topic. Now, since it is commercial-free, we are going to take just a brief commercial break before we get to this interview. So, let's get that break out of the way. And just as a reminder, you can always find me on Twitter at Jessie's POV. You can email me at the station at jessiespov@klrnradio.com. And I will see you on the other side.
All writers are prone to becoming so attached to our characters and stories that we struggle to see why a passage may not be working. It takes another set of eyes to help us nurture our writing to full maturity. At Black Wolf Editorial Services, we strive to enable writers to develop and grow, shaping stories into masterpieces that can stand the test of time. Editing services are provided for all genres and all age categories. Services range from the critique of the short story through to line edits on full-length novels. We also offer assistance on generating writers' bios for your websites. We won't abandon you to the masses. We want to celebrate with you in your successes. Black Wolf Editorial Services, nurturing your writing into maturity. For a full list of services and prices, visit us at blackwolfeditorial.com.
Hey, this is John Preston, Marine Combat Veteran and Pacific Records recording artist. Just reaching out to have you check out our new album, Battle Cry, Songs of America's Heroes, an album featuring phenomenal other combat veteran artists like Scott Brown of the Scooter Brown Band, Ryan Weaver, Rowdy Johnson, just an incredible mix of people. This is all veterans telling our stories and our lives, and we're giving 100% of our proceeds to the Valkyrie Initiative to help veterans and first responders integrate back into society. I myself have battled with post-traumatic stress for many years and lost my own brother, a Marine Corps veteran, to suicide. I ask that you step with us and make this happen. We are in pre-order right now and release on March 17th. Go to iTunes, go to Amazon, buy. We plan on making the charts and making it at a very high level, and your support right now makes a difference. This is the release of my new song, Superman Falls, which is actually about the loss of my own brother, which happened last year, and I would love for everyone to check it out, to listen, and hopefully it'll make a difference in many lives.
As a mother, you don't want to have to worry about this bill is coming, but then she needs this chemo. That's a decision you shouldn't have to make.
At St. Jude, a family never sees a bill at all. It's like the world has been lifted off of your shoulders.
The treatment doesn't get any better than what you receive at St. Jude. It saved my life. It saved my daughter's life. It saved our family.
St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Finding cures. Saving children. Learn more at stjude.org.
All right, this is Jessie. How y'all doing out there today? You know I've missed you when we're not talking. What, you don't think I've missed you? It's just been one of those crazy weeks, folks, and I have done my darndest. But as this is Saturday, I'm not alone. Nope. I've got my favorite recurring guest, Justin Kinney. How you doing there today, Justin?
I'm doing pretty well today. Thanks for having me on.
All right. You've got quite the psychological topic for us today, huh?
Yeah, I thought we could touch on kind of a interesting topic today of suicide terrorism and how exactly, people decide to do that.
Oh, you mean good old homicide bomber.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. All right, so how long have we had suicide bombers?
Well, suicide attacks, historically have often been part of military campaigns. We've seen suicide attacks go back, all the way to the first century with some of the ancient groups. But in modern times, you could really look at World War II with the Japanese kamikaze pilots. There were roughly 3,000 of those such attacks during that period, but that was part of a larger military campaign. Post World War II, we really didn't see any suicide attacks worldwide until about the 80s, when Hezbollah kind of came about, and the Israeli occupation and kind of the lower parts of Lebanon, and that's really where we would consider kind of the modern suicide terror started.
Okay, so good old Iranian-funded Hezbollah started it all, huh?
Well, it wasn't Hezbollah at the time, but it was kind of a precursor group to them, where they kind of came out of it. There was a car bomb at an embassy in Beirut back in '81, I believe, and that was really the first known suicide terrorist attack in at least in modern times.
Was that the barracks bombing, or you're discussing the embassy?
The barracks
bombing?
one, yeah, the embassy bombing would have been the first one. That was the Iraqi embassy, actually. But then the U.S. Marine barracks was 2 years later.
Okay, so the Iraqis were actually the target of the first one, huh?
It was. You had it was the Dawa Party, Islamic political party, essentially. They set off a car bomb at the Iraqi embassy in Beirut. And that was the very first instance that we know of, at least in modern times.
Sounds like Beirut was quite the hotspot for a while.
It was, and frankly, it still kind of is. Just a few months ago, there was an attack in Beirut as well.
All right, so what makes these people tick?
Well, we tend to look at these things as kind of an act of desperation or fanaticism, but there's actually a fair amount of strategic logic to it. We see suicide attacks take place in certain areas and in certain times that are irrational in a sense. Like, for instance, we tend to see suicide attacks take place in democracies more often than non-democracies. And, the thought behind that is, that in a democracy, there's more open, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and so it allows the terrorist group to kind of rationalize it to the public more. And be able to kind of explain their acts, and that implies a rational strategy to their decision to commit such acts. So we can't really look at this as some sort of spontaneous, irrational decision, but rather as a strategic logic that at least in their minds serves some sort of greater purpose.
All right, so somebody wouldn't just wake up tomorrow and decide, I want to go blow myself up at the nearest Starbucks.
Not usually. I mean, certainly we have some crazy people out there, but that's not what we're talking about when we talk about suicide terror.
Okay, so how do you define suicide terror?
Well, that's a really good question, and to be honest, there's some debate about this a little bit, but mostly you look at violent attack that already falls under the classification of terror, in which the attacker expects to die. Like, there's a 100% chance, essentially. So this would not include something like an attack where there's a high probability of death but not a zero probability, so like a reckless charge into battle, would not be considered a suicide attack because there's at least a chance that you would survive that. So for a suicide terror attack to be considered that the suicide part must be assured, and then it also must fall under the kind of general definition of terrorism as well. So you wouldn't be considering things like high-risk attacks, rampage shootings like Virginia Tech or Sandy Hook or Columbine. Those wouldn't be considered under this. And frankly, you probably wouldn't even consider proxy bombings under a true suicide attack where you kind of strap the bomb to somebody else and make them commit the act. That's a little different as well.
Okay. I think the scariest one out of that would be the proxy bombing, because how do you force someone else to go blow themselves up?
Yeah, that's really a terrifying one. And a lot of times, well, probably the most common is with children. We've seen that Boko Haram does this, and several other groups as well, where they strap bombs to kids and then have some sort of remote trigger. Where the kid doesn't really quite understand what's going on, or at least doesn't fully understand it. So those are, at least in my opinion, the scariest, I guess you would say.
Scariest, and I'd have to qualify them as the sickest. I mean, I'm sorry, children are supposed to be precious.
I would absolutely agree. That's, it's utterly horrifying.
And I have heard reports of coming out of Dashland or ISIS, to those of you who aren't regular listeners to this show, where they've actually handcuffed people to the steering wheels of car bombs and handcuffed them to mortar pieces and things like that, so they keep shooting no matter what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just sick.
It is. Like I said, it's horrifying. That, though, would genuinely not be considered a suicide attack if you're being forced to do it. We usually think of suicide more as a decision to do something that kills you.
So now that we've got the definition sort of pinned down, why don't you give us an example of suicide terror? And of course, there's one glaring U.S. example.
Well, sure. I mean, that's the biggest example that I imagine most of the listeners here are familiar with would be 9/11. That's actually an interesting case because it didn't involve bombs like you typically think of a suicide bomber. They involved planes as the weapons, which is fairly unique. I mean, there have been other cases, but it's very rare, mostly because it's hard to get your hands on a plane. But that's obviously the big classic example of a suicide attack where the attacker knew he was going to die and brought down a lot of people with him.
Yeah, and in the classic thing of terror, it succeeded. It terrorized the nation and definitely made the headlines. It
did, and in a kind of a larger sense too, it was often seen as kind of an act of provocation. They were hoping the U.S. would overreact and respond, and to an extent, we did. We invaded 2 countries, overthrew multiple regimes, and that event actually ended up sparking a lot more terrorist recruitment back in the Middle East as well. So these groups actually saw their numbers rise because of this attack. Not only because it was successful, but also because the U.S. was seen as overreaching and invading countries and causing more problems. And it actually ended up working kind of on 2 fronts for them, at least temporarily, until we kind of wiped out a lot of their leadership.
Yeah, but I can tell you, at least from the news reports I've seen, Al-Qaeda ain't gone, especially AQAP over in Yemen.
No, they're certainly not. They lost, I want to say it was like the top 30 or so commanders in their organization, but they have regrouped, and they still are around and causing problems.
Do you think we'll ever be able to get rid of radical Islamic terrorism?
I mean, ever is a strong statement. I think it's possible. We've talked on here before about how terrorism has seemed to go through waves with different ideologies, and it's certainly possible that a new wave will come along that will kind of take its place. But this religious wave of terror does seem to be a little bit more persistent than previous waves. I think it's going to be a lot harder to eradicate.
Okay. All right. So what makes someone decide that they are going to kill themselves and try and take out as many innocent people as possible?
Yeah, well, a lot of this there are personal reasons, but we tend to think of it, at least today, as religious, right? Where there is some sort of religious incentive. There's some sort of afterlife, so this life doesn't matter as much, or you get some sort of reward in the afterlife, and a lot of that at least plays into it in today's terms. That doesn't mean it's always been religious. I mean, LTTE, which would be the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, they were secular separatists, and for a long period of time they were kind of the world leaders in suicide terror. So it's certainly not only religious, but at least since the Tamil Tigers were defeated, it's become almost exclusively religious. And that kind of ideology allows for individuals to kind of discount what happens in this life because there's some sort of promise of reward or even just the existence of another life after death. And that all kind of ties into this life not mattering as much. It allows them to kind of rationalize their suicide behavior.
All right, I think I'm starting to see this. I mean, I'm Jewish, but I also know of the Christian perspective that there is an afterlife in heaven. And so you're saying someone would say that this life doesn't matter because they're going to go to their version of heaven?
Well, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it certainly wouldn't matter as much. If there is another life beyond this one, then this life matters less. And so it becomes easier to justify. Now, obviously, depending on which faith you're talking about and individual personal faith, you may count this life more than someone else might, particularly if you believe what happens in this life determines the next life as well. But if this is the only life you have, then it certainly would mean more than if there's another life after death. And I think that's at least where you start from, at least moving down the path towards suicide terror, where you start with this idea that this life is not all there is. There is something else. I will not be ending myself forever by committing this act. Again, that doesn't turn you into a suicide terrorist, obviously, but it certainly, I think, is a starting point that gets used a lot within these religious terrorist groups.
Okay, so once we've established that in this person's mind there is another life, and that's where they're going to go if they commit this act, how do they go from that to actually walking into the building, flying the plane into the building, or going to the cafe and pushing the button on the bomb that blows themselves up?
That's a very, very good question. And it's something that has stumped a lot of people, particularly on an individual level anyway. Why does an individual person do this? So I think we probably want to start at kind of more the group level. Why do groups see this as something that's good? Because at least, well, go back to like 83 or so. Prior to that, I mean, there was Islamic-based terrorism, but suicide bombing within the faith was essentially non-existent. But once you started to see it pop up with Hezbollah, it spread remarkably quickly throughout the Middle East as a legitimate tactic that they were using. And, a lot of this, at least in my opinion, it ties into a couple different reasons. First would be that suicide terrorism is more deadly than normal terrorism. It causes more damage. That I have a statistic here between 81 and 06. About 4% of all terror attacks were suicide, but it caused about a third of all terrorism-related deaths. So it was much more deadly. A suicide attack kills about 4 times as many people as a regular terrorist attack. So from a group perspective, this is a tactic that makes more sense to use. There's no need for an escape plan. There's no need to fear for your own life. There's no remote or delayed detonation. So your mission is much more likely to be successful and be much more likely to be completed. You can make last-minute adjustments. They're very flexible. And it's very cost-effective, essentially. It also guarantees media coverage, which is a big element of it. So then it comes to, how do you convince an individual person to do this? And that's where it gets really tricky. And it's probably, it's going to vary a little bit depending on who the person is, person to person. Some people may lean towards more ideological arguments, that this is some sort of martyrdom, and martyrdom is seen as honorable in many cultures. Others, may be a family motivation. A lot of these groups will pay the family of suicide bombers, thousands of dollars. Plus, on top of that, sometimes they'll give even more like material perks, nicer amenities or nicer homes to the families of suicide bombers.
Right.
And there's actually an ideology that's cropped up in certain Islamic-based terror groups where if you commit an act of martyrdom, then your family actually will achieve salvation as well. We often hear about the whole 70 virgins thing, but equally as important is this belief that when you commit suicide acts, 70 relatives of yours will get into heaven as well. And that's a little lesser known, but certain groups do believe that as well. And so sometimes it's almost seen as sacrificial for yourself to get your family members into heaven. And so there's kind of a self-sacrifice element, there's an ideological element, and these kind of motivations all kind of weave together to convince an individual to do this.
Definitely sounds interesting. I mean, I'm sitting here going, all right, I've probably got a little too much of a Western culture mindset here, but I'm sitting here going, I guess I'm not the right religion, because I know that going somewhere and killing a bunch of innocent people, first of all, isn't something I could live with, but then, of course, I wouldn't be living through it to have to look myself in the mirror the next day. But secondly, my conscience would not allow that, Justin. Why do I want to kill innocent people at all?
Well, I think most of us would land in that boat, where there's just no motivation. Like, why in the world would you ever want to kill somebody who's innocent? And I think that's where you get into a lot of these ideological arguments. The idea that maybe nobody's truly innocent, or some sort of theological-based argument where they're the infidel. There was even a group in Japan, I think we may have mentioned it, Aum Shinrikyo, on a previous recording, but they essentially believe that they were saving people by preventing them from getting bad karma. So there's a lot of different weird twists that groups have added into this to try to justify it and to make it seem like it's the best thing to do. Killing infidels, saving them, well, whatever it is, it's all about some sort of justification that could help convince these recruits to commit such an act.
I'm still just floored, because it's like, okay, how I can see how you have to have the multiple layers here. Is there a third leg to this justification, convincing thing, or is it mostly you just get someone so deep into the ideology that they buy it? Well,
I think there is. I guess you could probably consider this a third leg. It is an ideological argument, but it's an ideological argument that's based around practicality, in the sense that these type of attacks are a form of intense psychological warfare that you don't get with other forms of terrorism. It allows them to compete against militaries that significantly outgun them. And suicide attacks have actually generally worked to get democracies to give in, much more so than normal terrorism. A suicide attack is much more effective at achieving your ideological goal. So while you personally may not achieve it, obviously as a suicide attack, you are helping the cause. There's kind of this practical element to it. Suicide bombings, they're inexpensive, they're effective, they're not as complicated or compromising as other forms of terrorist operations. They guarantee media coverage. The suicide terrorist is kind of the ultimate smart bomb, in a sense. So it's very effective at achieving your goal as an organization. So if you're willing to sacrifice yourself for the organization, you can see it as being an effective means of helping them achieve their long-term goal.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. So basically, let me see if I've got this straight. First of all, the person has to have a belief that there's an afterlife. Whatever form that takes, there's an afterlife.
For the most part, yes. There have been some exceptions, but
overall,
yeah, at least today, yes. It's almost exclusively some sort of religious element to it.
Okay, and then secondly, the person has to obviously believe in fill-in-the-blank cause and really deeply and truly believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have to be willing to give their life to further that cause. So that's kind of the third.
Yeah, and then even on top of that too would be some of the family considerations too. If you think you're doing it to help your family, particularly in places where poverty is such that this may be the only way that your family can survive, is to have somebody help them.
What I'm trying to figure out is, what guarantee do you have that the family will actually get what they've been promised? You're not around to see it through.
You don't, and that's certainly tricky. I imagine they can point to cases of other people who have done it, and their families got it as kind of a trust element. But there's certainly no guarantee once you're gone that they will go through with it.
Now, I have done a little bit of reading on my own, and not too much because, well, the topic is kind of a little bit gruesome. But I've heard
it's very gruesome.
Yeah, I've read pretty gruesome stuff, but it wasn't a topic that particularly caught my attention until today.
Mm-hmm.
I have read that martyrs get special funerals, whether they get any of the body back or not.
Yes, and that's a little bit of a group-by-group thing. Some groups will do that, some won't, but yes, that's not uncommon to give them some sort of special funeral treatment or some sort of special incentive beyond that. I know a lot of groups in their magazines will post like Martyr of the Week type things where you get to have some sort of honorary page dedicated to yourself and gain some sort of infamy that way, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's...
I mean, to an extent, I hope this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, if it made a lot more sense, you'd have a lot more suicide terror. So it's good that it's still confusing.
Okay, so the fact I'm confused isn't a bad thing.
I would certainly hope that you're still confused by this. Like I said, if this was something that made sense to everybody, we'd see a lot more of it. So I'm glad that it's still confusing. We can start to get kind of a sense of why they might do it, but at the end of the day, it's still something that should confuse most people.
All right, that makes me feel better, Justin, because I'm sitting there going, wait a minute, I'm not tracking here. Something's missing. Something's not clicking. And then when you said, I hope you're still confused. Oh, I'm still supposed to be confused. Okay. Phew.
Yeah, this is not something that I hope a lot of people understand to a strong extent. We can start to get at it and start to see kind of the elements of what might push somebody over the edge, but at the end of the day, this is something that very few people actually do, and that's a good thing. Very few actually understand it.
Now, I know you've done a lot of research on the psychology side, and I'm going to throw you a question. Might seemingly sound just a little bit off the wall, but I'm not sure it's too far off out of your wheelhouse here.
Okay.
Suicide bomber, mass murderer. Is there some kind of psychological similarity there?
Similarity, I would agree with. Now, to an extent, a mass murderer, we'd have to define if there is a suicide element to that as well. Like, say, the Columbine attacks or the Virginia Tech attacks, where they were pretty confident they weren't getting out of there alive.
But what about
there is definitely a similarity.
What about your mass murderers like Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy?
Those are usually considered to be a little different because they don't generally expect to get caught. They want to keep doing it. Their attacks are not suicide-based. Now, they know eventually they may end up getting caught and it may cost them, but the attacks themselves are not ideologically driven as much as psychologically driven. There's some sort of delusion or psychopathy that plays into that. So I would say serial killers would fall under a little different category, but say a mass murderer like the Virginia Tech attacker or somebody like that would fall much closer into the same category as a suicide bomber. At the same time, though, you have to understand that those attacks are lone wolf for the most part. They're not ideologically driven in the sense that there's a group of people who are pushing this. Usually there's some sort of mental illness or something else that plays into those attacks, where we don't actually see a whole lot of at least documented mental illness among suicide terrorists.
Right, unless you start to move into the proxy, suicide attack by proxy.
Right, and that's I would say very different, because you're taking advantage of somebody else and not suffering the cost yourself.
I know we don't exactly have suicide bombers around to talk to.
Right.
So how do you get this information, and how do these studies get done?
Well, there are a couple ways. One is a little sketchier, but it's about trying to run background checks on people after they've committed the act. You can identify who did it. You can start to track back through their history. That gets very tricky, especially in areas that don't have good records. If you're in a place like, say, Syria right now, you're not likely to find a whole lot of background on some of these people. But that's at least a starting point. You can start to look and see, okay, was their family killed? Is there some sort of past trauma, PTSD, drug addiction? What led them to this point where they were vulnerable enough to do it? But again, that gets really sketchy. Secondly, is more of a psychological study where you can look at similar cases and try to extrapolate from that. Again, it gets a little iffy because there's a lot of guesswork involved. The third one is probably the most interesting in the sense that we actually can talk to some suicide bombers, because not every suicide bomber is successful. And there have been quite a few who have failed in their task. They've tried but failed. Either the bomb didn't go off or they didn't die like they thought they would. And so those people have been captured, and we have been able to talk to some of them and gain some sort of insight that way. I think that's probably the most interesting. At the same time, though, we're looking at the failed ones, so they're not very good at what they're doing, so there may be a bias there. But I think it allows for kind of a very unique approach to examining these individual cases.
So would, the shoe bomber be one of the, quote, failed ones?
Sure, that would be a good example of it. Because at that point, we expect he was pretty sure he was going to die. He was trying to set off a bomb in his shoe. Not likely to survive that. But it failed, and we were able to capture him and talk to him. And while I'm not specific on exactly what we learned from that case individually, those type of attacks are what we would look for somebody tried and failed, because they went through the whole radicalization process as well, but something just didn't go right at the end step, and so everything was the same up until that last little bit, and so we can use them as kind of proxies for the attackers who did successfully do it.
So basically, their bomb making skills or their bomb maker failed them.
Right. Now, there are a couple cases of people who were, supposed to be, and then at the last minute got cold feet. And so we can use those as well. But you wonder if the psychology is a little different there, because they got cold feet and somebody else didn't. So what was different? So that may be, again, kind of a bias. But there are some cases of that as well.
Okay. So how does someone get radicalized?
Well, there are a lot of different mechanisms for that. And again, we're kind of getting at an element of individualism where everybody's a little bit different. But essentially what you're looking for are a handful of steps, where there has to be some sort of grievance, something where you think this isn't right. And then you have to progress down the line from this isn't right to this isn't fair. There's some sort of injustice taking place. And then there's another step where you have to kind of take that unfairness and apply it to somebody, some sort of attribution that it's your fault that this isn't fair. And then usually beyond that, there's another step where you kind of have to distance yourself or dehumanize them and turn it from it's your fault to you're evil and therefore this is justified. But again, this kind of varies from person to person. Some people go through kind of a personal grievance. There was some sort of revenge element to it. My loved one was hurt, therefore that kicks off the radicalization. Sometimes it's a political grievance. Sometimes it's about being disconnected from the rest of your life. It's a mechanism called unfreezing, where suddenly you lose all of your loved ones, or suddenly you move to a new country as a refugee where you feel totally disconnected. And you start seeking social ties, and a lot of times you get kind of tied in with the wrong people because you feel so alone. Some people it's about thrill seeking, status. The thrill of guns and money and the ideology matters less than the thrill of the excitement. Sometimes it's about the power. I'll call it the power of love. I know that sounds silly, but it's about joining these groups to be with a loved one or to protect the loved one, to protect family members, to provide for family members, and that can start the radicalization process. And then we even see cases where it's a very slow, almost slippery slope style radicalization, where you start the person on some sort of very minor detail. Maybe you start them as a lookout for something, and then you move them slowly down the line until they become radicalized. And at that point, it becomes almost impossible to pinpoint exactly when they cross the line into being radicalized. But it's just such a gradual process that they almost don't even realize it until they are radicalized. And so there's a lot of different mechanisms that can lead to radicalization, and that's where it gets tricky. And you can't apply that to a large group of people. You kind of have to look at it on an individual terrorist basis.
So let's talk about, and I don't know how much you know about the individual case, but the Columbine shooting, because that's something most Americans are at least somewhat familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Would they have had more of the loner disconnect from society thing, even though they still had their families, but they just didn't feel accepted in school and accepted in their peer group kind of thing?
Probably. I would caution that I would not consider them terrorists necessarily. I think there was some mental instability there. It wasn't so much about ideology or anything. It was very personal. So I wouldn't consider them terrorists. But just for comparison's sake, yes, I would consider them to have seen themselves as being disconnected, right? About social, not necessarily about social outcasts, because they specifically weren't, but about that perception of being disconnected, of being different. And just to apply this to terrorists, this is why you tend to see second generation immigrants in certain places pop up as terrorists, because they feel like they should be integrated into society because they were born there and raised there, but because they're still they're second generation immigrants, they don't feel like they really belong, and so there's kind of a disconnect there. And so when you talk about immigrants coming to places and becoming terrorists, it's almost never the first generation. It's that second or the third generation that becomes radicalized, and it's probably that feeling of disconnect where you feel like you should be a part of society because you've been there your whole life, but for whatever reason, and it can vary place by place, you don't. And I think that's what happens in a lot of places, particularly in Europe, on places like France, that make it very difficult to become a part of French society, and other places as well. That heavy disconnect, even though you feel like there shouldn't be one because you've been there.
Okay, and I understand that the Columbine shooters were not terrorists, but it was just the most obvious thing that popped into my brain anyway.
Yeah, that's something that a lot of people here in this country understand and can remember.
So I'm going to throw just a slight political spin into this, and if you want to just pass the buck, I totally understand. President Trump's ban on refugees. If it's a second and third generation, it tends to be the problem. is stopping the first generation going to help us, or doing more vetting on the first generation? Because you look at some of the terrorist attackers from this country that have happened in this country, like the guy that set off the bomb in the dumpster in New York City and New Jersey and went on that little rampage. I believe he was second generation.
Mm-hmm.
So what is more thoroughly vetting the first generation going to have to do with the second generation?
Well, I think, and I don't presume to understand the president's thought process on this, but my understanding of it is that he's less concerned about that element of it as he is about the ISIS claim that they're trying to sneak people in with refugees. And so these are people who had been pre-radicalized, sneaking in with others. And so my understanding is at least the rationale behind the ban is that element. They're trying to prevent these already radicalized people from getting in, and they're not as concerned about second and third generation. Because second and third generation is something that you can deal with once they're here, helping them integrate into society, making it easier for them so they don't feel completely alienated. That's a whole other element that I don't think deals with immigration specifically, as it does with dealing with them once they're here. Helping them feel less disconnected and feel like they can become a part of society. I think there's more of a concern now, at least from the Trump administration, about these already radicalized people sneaking in with the refugees. I imagine that's what he's trying to prevent.
I have to agree with you, but of course,
credit, ISIS has said they are trying to do that. They have announced that's something they are trying to do. Now, whether they are or not, I don't know. It would certainly make sense that they would be attempting that.
Well, I'd have to say that they are, because I've actually seen reports of it in European news where, someone is a refugee and then commits a terrorist attack. And I'm thinking, we're talking first generation refugee that then goes on to commit the terrorist attack, not second or third. We're going to set them on the shelf for right now. Mm-hmm. But I'm thinking that they have successfully planted, at least over in Europe, some of those first generation ones.
Well, yeah, I think, it's hard to prove that, but I think from what we've seen, that certainly makes sense.
I know this is an individual thing, and I know it's probably kind of hard to pin down, but overall, general broad stroke, radicalization, does it take? I'm sure it takes a while. Are we talking weeks, days, weeks, months, or years?
Well, that's hard to know. And as you kind of mentioned, it's something that's very individual to the person. There are certain mechanisms that happen faster than others. The unfreezing one about suddenly becoming disconnected, that one can happen pretty quickly. Still probably not talking weeks necessarily, but months to maybe years. And then you have some that are much, much slower and could easily be years. As they get more and more fed up with whatever personal or political grievance they're seeing. I'd be very hesitant to put a time frame on it, though, because it can vary wildly depending on who you're talking about and what situation.
But would you feel safe in saying it's not a matter of days in most cases? Yes.
Now that doesn't mean we don't see people who commit acts after something that happened a couple of days ago, but usually that's like kind of the straw that broke the camel's back type thing, the last trigger, and it has less to do with kind of a long-term thing that's been building. I'd feel pretty comfortable saying it's very rarely in the days. We're talking weeks to months, maybe years in a lot of cases.
Okay, so is there any part of this that you wanted to mention that I haven't brought up? Because this is a rather convoluted, twisted topic.
Yeah, well, I thought one thing that's kind of interesting is women committing suicide attacks because about 5% of all suicide attackers are female. And there are some very specific cases that are kind of interesting. The PKK in the Kurdistan territories, the women are actually the majority of suicide attackers there. We had the Black Widow group in Chechnya, which was largely suicide bombers. It was essentially an all-female assassin team. And so, interestingly, we tend to see women attackers a little bit different than male attackers. We often see them, being a little bit more on the personal grievance side as opposed to political grievance. But we also see women suicide attacks as being more deadly than male ones. And I find that to be very intriguing as to why that would be. And it probably is the explanation for why we have been seeing more of these in recent years.
I'd have to say it probably goes back to the overall societal norm that women are less dangerous.
I think that makes sense. And people allow women to get closer to them. And we've seen that just in average society. If you're out in public, you're much more likely to let a woman stand really close to you, say on like a train or something, than you are a man. You feel much more comfortable allowing them to get closer and allowing them to get themselves into the right situations. And so I think that's probably why they tend to be more deadly, because they have more access to getting close to people. But it's certainly something that I think terrorist groups now are seeing works, and we're starting to see more radicalization of women to do this, or even in a couple cases, men dressed as women. We've seen a couple instances of that as well, where they're trying to take advantage of that.
Yeah, you certainly can't tell much about a person through a burqa.
Yeah, well, that's another thing too. In certain cultures, women are much more clothed than others, and so it's in those cultures it makes sense to use that to an advantage. And obviously the Middle East would be the kind of the classic example of that.
I've even heard reports and know for a fact that from time to time our special forces will dress as women to accomplish a task.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think that makes a lot of sense, given kind of the psychology of women being more trustworthy, much more likely to trust a woman who comes near you than a man. I think that makes sense that all forms of groups would use that to their advantage.
And that even ties back to the female assassin thing we were discussing on a previous episode, that women assassins, while you don't hear about them as much, they can be very effective because, again, psychologically, you're trained almost from day one, and I know of very few cultures where it's one of those things of women are just dangerous, that women are not dangerous. That's pretty much drilled into your head, and that women are the weaker gender and that they need protecting, and that's an overall societal norm, I think, around the world.
It's very common, yes.
I'd have to say I think the one culture where that's probably not as true, and you're going to get a kick out of this one, Justin, Israel.
Mm-hmm. I could see that, yeah.
They have,
especially with them, being involved in the military draft and that being expected. That's very uncommon around the world.
It is extremely uncommon. Now, there was another country, and I forget which one, that actually went to add women to their draft, and it actually made the news. I'm thinking Sweden, but don't quote me. It was either Sweden or Switzerland, but I don't recall.
I remember hearing about that. I'm blanking where it was too, but I remember hearing about that story.
So, do you think women are more likely to have a really good chance of success just based on their gender?
I think there are opportunities that exist for them that don't exist for men. Again, there's a lot of individuality to this, but I think there is the opportunity to be more successful because of that.
And I looked it up real quick. It was Sweden.
Critical alert from Microsoft.
All right, Justin, I did a little quick research, and it was Sweden that just added women back to the draft, or added women to the draft.
Okay.
So, and that was relatively recently, in the past couple of weeks to a month.
Yeah. I remember seeing that news story pop up.
Yeah, it crossed my feed too. So I find it funny when we see the same news articles, and we don't communicate too regularly in between recordings, but we seem to have a lot of interests in common.
Yeah, I think so.
So, all right. Anything else you want to add before we round out this episode?
Well, I think we should mention briefly that, we talk a lot about religious suicide terrorism, but there are cases of non-religious suicide terrorism. Excuse me. And I think LTTE in Sri Lanka deserves a bit of a mention. For a period in time, they were the world leaders in suicide terrorism. We often think of the Middle East or these religious groups as being the ones who made it popular, but it was Sri Lanka where suicide terror was perfected in a sense. They're the only terrorist organization in the world to assassinate 2 world leaders. They had almost 400 suicide attacks, and they're the ones who invented the suicide belt. They're the first ones to use women in suicide attacks, and I think it's just worth mentioning because a lot of the groups that today use it got a lot of their tactics from the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka.
Okay, what 2 world leaders did they assassinate?
They assassinated, I'm not going to get the names, but they assassinated the Indian Prime Minister and the Sri Lankan President.
1 attack or 2 separate?
I believe there was 2 separate attacks. And I think at least one of those was done by a woman.
Wow.
As well.
So what else can you tell us about the Tamil Tigers? Because they just sound really interesting, if that's the root of most of the modern terrorist tactics. Definitely
it's the root of the modern suicide terror anyway. So the Tamil Tigers were a separatist, nationalist group. It was based in an ethnicity called the Tamil people, Tamil. So it was an ethnic-based nationalist group in this little island of Sri Lanka, which is off the coast of India. And they were essentially very upset about kind of the history of imbalance between this Tamil minority and the majority ethnic group, which was called the Sinhalese. And so they saw it as being very discriminatory towards their ethnicity, and so they started kind of fighting for their own independent state, which they wanted to be called Tamil Eelam, in kind of the northern part of Sri Lanka, kind of the northeast corner. And so they started committing these acts of terror, and they actually spawned almost a civil war between the Tamil people and the rest of Sri Lanka. But they're very well known for their suicide attacks. As we mentioned, they assassinated 2 world leaders by it, and they're very, very well known for how they perfected these attacks. But it's really intriguing because they are not a religious-based group, and it kind of runs contrary to what we tend to think of in suicide terrorism as being religious and having this afterlife element to it, and that being a lot of the reasoning for why they feel comfortable committing a suicide act. But you don't have that in the Tamil Tigers, despite essentially being the worldwide leaders in suicide terror for probably close to 2 decades.
1 second, Justin. That is fascinating, Justin, that there is no religious perspective. So do these people think they just have one life and they do it and they're dead, or never got to the bottom of that one?
Essentially, although I will say there are a lot of members who are Hindu, and so there is that kind of element of reincarnation present, but it has nothing to do with the actual ideology of the group, and not every member is Hindu either. Religion just isn't really a part of their ideology.
And I was doing a little research on them, just our good old friend Wikipedia, which, as we've said before, isn't the best authority in the world, but it will give you a quick overview. And it was a militant group based in Sri Lanka, as you've said many times, and it was a nationalist insurgency, which you've already mentioned. And their big thing was inter-ethnic imbalances.
Mm-hmm.
At least it looks like from this article. So
yeah, because they were the minority, and they saw the Sinhalese ethnic majority as repressing them. And so there was a lot of kind of ethnic discrimination that they believed was taking place.
Okay. I just think it's amazing that they can push someone to that extent. And I'm still sitting here blown away going, why would you ever want to kill yourself? I'm sorry. I like to think that my life matters, Justin, and I'm not sure if I've got one trip through this world or more, but I kind of like my life right now. I don't want to give that up.
Yeah, and shockingly, the Tigers were so successful at this that they actually had a lottery system, so that they could pick who the suicide bombers were going to be, and people would apply to become suicide bombers, and they picked them via lottery. And that blows my mind.
Okay, they had a lottery because they had that many people going, pick me, pick me?
Yeah, essentially. It's absolutely crazy. And they didn't have the religious ideology to back it. They weren't promising an afterlife or anything for these people. That blows my mind. I have no idea how they managed to convince people to that extreme.
Then what were they promising?
Well, a lot of it was based in kind of this culture in Sri Lanka. There was kind of this idea particularly in the Tamil people in their civilization, that death in battle was very honorable. It was much more community-based ideology than that individual-based. Here in America, we're very individualistic, but in the eastern part of the world, China, India, Sri Lanka, there is a lot more community-based ideology, and so dying in battle was seen as very honorable. This martyrdom element. And I imagine they played up that pretty heavily. But I have a hard time understanding how you can get from that to a lottery system. So, like I said, it really stuns me.
Makes me think back to the kamikaze pilots from the Japanese, because definitely the group is greater than the whole. They're a perfect example
of that community-based culture, where it's not individualistic. You're living for the community, not for yourself.
Although if someone came up to me and told me I had to die for my community, and it wasn't something, well, there are things I would fight and try to succeed at, but I'm not sure that I'd ever say, yeah, I'll go in with 100% probability of my death. But I can.
I think everybody, I'd like to think everybody would want to come out alive, but there are individuals who go in with that 100% certainty, and that's where it gets very, very difficult to understand, especially when you don't have the idea of the afterlife being used as that motivation.
I have to say, Justin, once again, you've blown my mind.
There's some very crazy things that blows my mind frequently as well.
All right, so anything else?
I think that's it. I've covered everything I had.
All right, so when you're not on the air with me discussing terrorism and psychology and all kinds of craziness, where can people find you?
So I have a Twitter account that people can find me on. It's Justin_R_Kinney. That's Kinney. And I also have a Facebook page for my authoring. As you mentioned here before, I have a book I've written called Precipice, and you can find me on Facebook. It's J. Robert Kinney is my pseudonym. You can find my author page on there.
All right, well, everybody, I'd like you to go out and like his page and pick up a copy of Precipice, because trust me, you think these shows are interesting? The book will not disappoint. And as always, you can find me on Twitter at Jessie'sPOV. And you can always drop me a line at the station at jessiespov@klrnradio.com. On that note, folks, we're out of here.